Go ahead and accept that. All right, on the next slide there, we have a reminder, we have some more events coming up with Dr. James. We have later, basically a month from now, we're gonna meet again to talk about words that work and encouraging plan giving. Later this week, we have an event for professional advisors, and you all are invited if you want to attend that. We're going to talk about the top 10 charitable planning strategies for professional advisors. And then later in July, we're going to get inside the mind of a donor. So you are welcome. Those are all listed on our event page. If you want to join us for those, you're welcome to. All right, next slide, please. And then everybody, please mark this on your calendar. We are going to host a networking social on August 16th at Brick West Brewing from 4 to 6 p.m. We are going to bring together all of our nonprofit friends and connect up with all of our professional advisors and do a networking social. So please add that to your calendar. More information will be forthcoming as we get closer to the event. All right, next up. All right, I'm going to turn over to Aaron to thank our sponsors.
Hey, thanks, Chris. Welcome, everybody. I'm Aaron McMurray, Chief Strategy Officer with the Novia Foundation. Really great to see all of you. Thanks for making time to be a part of today's event. If you are like most of us on this call, you by now need no additional convincing about the potential for all of our nonprofit organizations when we talk to our donors in a way that accesses that deeper reservoir of generosity and wealth. And the 5% invested, fully committed campaign was 100% motivated by the objective and the goal of empowering all of us to do that as effectively as possible and to take advantage of the wealth that is going to transfer in our region and to harness that wealth and invest it back into nonprofits like all of those represented on this call. So we're honored to have you here today. We're honored to be joined by Dr. James, and we're really honored by our presenting sponsor, Idaho Central Credit Union, who through their impact across our region and their generosity have made this event possible. There we go. And so a huge warm thank you to Idaho Central Credit Union. Thank you so much for your generosity. I think we have a couple folks on the call today from Idaho Central Credit Union. If any of you are on, if you would give a wave on your screen right now or give a thumbs up on your screen so we know who you are. We want to thank you for your generosity and for making today's event possible. I also want to give a shout out to our presenting partner for this event, the Inland Northwest Plan Giving Council. In this session, in the next session, you're going to hear some incredible strategies for talking to donors in a way that harnesses deeper generosity through complex gifts, planned gifts, other types of gifts that require some thoughtful planning from a donor. And this is the work that the Inland Northwest Plan Giving Council does year in and year out and has done so well, is providing a place and a space for planned giving professionals in our region to convene and gather. So we're really honored to have Inland Northwest Plan Giving Council as our presenting partner for today's event. If you're looking for a place to join up and be a part of a community of professionals, Inland Northwest Plan Giving Council meets on a regular basis throughout the year, providing excellent content, networking, and professional support and partnership to plan giving professionals around the region. We're joined today by Jennifer Hicks. Jennifer, would you give a very quick welcome to everyone on the call, and thank you to the Inland Northwest Plan Giving Council for your partnership in today's event. And maybe Jennifer will be joining us soon. So if she jumps on, we'll give her an opportunity to give
Sorry, I'm here.
There you are.
I
Hi,
guess
Jennifer.
I was muted.
Yeah.
So hi, everyone. I'm Jennifer Hicks. I'm the president of the Inland Northwest Plan Giving Council. Thank you for the great introduction, Aaron. Yes, our website is inwpgc.org if you'd like more information, and we'd love to have all of you join us. We meet, we have 5 meetings a year, September through May, with a social in June. And we were founded in 1994, and we provide programming and educational events that support of the work of nonprofit development officers, financial professionals, and estate planning advisors throughout the Inland Northwest.
All right, thanks, Jennifer. All right, without further ado, I'd like to introduce today's speaker. We've got Dr. Russell James, who has a tremendous history and experience in the plan giving arena as a plan giving fundraiser, an estate planning attorney, major gifts fundraiser, a college president, and a professor, and a very long distance runner. So without further ado, Dr. Russell James.
Okay, thanks so much. Appreciate the introduction there. So we're going to be taking a look at some ideas today about how to have wealth conversations that inspire major gifts of assets. And we're going to look first at a bit of the science. In other words, we're going to look at some of the the theory behind why this works. Yes, you're going to get some theory because I'm a professor. That's what we do. But then we're going to get really practical, and we'll be talking about specific words and phrases, how to frame these conversations, a variety of different, very practical examples you can use to encourage these kinds of conversations that lead to major gifts of assets. So let's start with a bit of the science side of it. And the science concept that I want to share with you is to understand that the secret to fundraising math is all about understanding the difference between gifts of wealth versus gifts of disposable income. So here's the fundamental concept to understand. Major gifts, major life investment gifts from the perspective of the donor, these are gifts of wealth, not gifts of disposable income. Now, this is a really basic distinction, but a lot of people actually miss this. They misunderstand this very simple idea that wealth is not income. Those are two very different things. And by the way, this matters a lot for fundraising because most donors will make their gifts only from their disposable income. But major life investment gifts, those are gifts of wealth. So wealth doesn't actually come from a paycheck. Wealth actually comes from owning assets that go up in value. And in fact, if you don't believe me that wealth doesn't come from a paycheck, you can look at some sports folks or celebrities with really big paychecks, and a lot of them manage to spend even more than that paycheck, and they don't actually build any wealth. Wealth instead, well, it's appreciated assets. How does wealth building work? Well, you buy assets with inheritance or borrowings or savings from income, and then you either pick the right assets, which usually involves some risk, or you also use personal effort to increase asset value. So when we look at the stories of wealth, we see this same process. Whether it is Bill Gates, who used personal effort to build an asset, which was his company, or Warren Buffett, who uncovered a new way to borrow money to purchase stocks, and then he picked the right stocks, or your neighbor, meaning that the predominant way that middle-class America builds wealth is to borrow money to buy an asset. We call it a mortgage, to buy a house that goes up in value. So whether it's Bill Gates or Warren Buffett or your neighbor, wealth comes from owning appreciated assets. Now, it's important to keep in mind that wealth is also a different money category. The story of wealth is the story of appreciated assets. And in fact, less than 3% of household wealth is held in cash or checking accounts. And so when we're talking about cash, well, we're talking about the small bucket. Asking for cash is asking from the small bucket. The checking account, that's where disposable income purchases are made. If you ask for cash, the natural reference point is, well, it's what I just spent at Starbucks. However, if you ask for a gift of appreciated assets, say a gift of stocks or real estate, my natural comparison point is much larger. It might be my entire stock portfolio, or if you're asking for a gift from my IRA, it might be my retirement savings. Asking for appreciated assets is asking from the big bucket. And conceptually, from a psychological perspective, large gifts are made possible by these large reference points. So this was sort of a fun experiment just to show how tiny little reminders can change people's behavior. In this experiment, people were going into a grocery store and they were asked if they wanted to participate in an experiment, and they were randomly assigned to answer one of two sets of questions. They were either asked about what's in your wallet or purse, do you have any cash or credit cards, or they were asked, do you own any stocks? Do you own any bonds? Do you own any certificates of deposit? Well, it turns out that just being asked that set of questions led those people to spend 36% more on average in their shopping trip. Now, we're not interested in people's grocery trips, but the point is we see this experimental behavior that becomes particularly important in charitable giving, which is when we reference a donor's wealth, that is a much larger reference point, which can lead to much larger gifts. Here's what we find from experimental research. A small ask from a small category, that's fine. That works well. That's the pennies a day argument. A big ask from a small category, that does not work well. However, a big ask from a big category, that's what works well. And that's what we're talking about with these major gifts of assets. So in one experiment, there was a monthly pledge where the gift amounts were described as so much a day, so the small amount, or so much a year. It was the same size gift. With the daily amount, the researchers found that people compared the gift with, quote, routinely encountered petty cash type of expenditures. But with the much larger annual amount, people compared the gift with, quote, infrequently encountered major expenditures. So the point is that the gift description changes the reference point. So which worked better? Was it better to describe a gift as only costing $1 or $4 or $7 a day, or $350, $1,400 or $2,500 a year? Again, for the smallest ask, the daily amount worked better. But for any request over $1,000, the results reversed. In other words, the pennies a day story works, but it only works for pennies. Some other experimental research shows us that a small reference point also makes future gifts small. In this experiment, people had a gift made on their behalf, and they had it either made as one large lump sum, or it was made on their behalf broken into small daily amounts. Later, people with this prior gifting were allowed to make their own decision to make a gift. And it turns out that if the previous gifting on their behalf had been broken into small amounts, they gave less when they had an opportunity to give. If it was given in one large lump sum, they gave more when they had the opportunity to give. What's the difference? The difference is the reference point. If the reference points feel small, then the gifts tend to stay small. By the way, there was actually a way to fix this. People gave less when their previous gifting was broken into small amounts because the reference point felt smaller. The solution that corrected this was to first show people the total of all the prior gifts that had been made before making the ask. Showing that big number, that big total first, increased donations by almost 50%. Another experiment showed that when people's prior gifts were described in total terms, people gave more. If they were described in monthly terms, people gave less. The small reference point encourages this small gift. The large reference point encourages the large gift. So the prior giving story connects to the future giving. If we describe a donor's past giving as several small gifts, that's a small gift story. If we describe it as a single large total, that's a different story. That changes the behavior because it changes the reference point. Here was another experiment that tested the best performing headline, and this was tested among 50,000 people with 6 different mailings. The best performing headline tested started with, they were a campaign donor for blank years. Your most generous gift was blank dollars. Thank you. Notice what this does. This is referencing how long that relationship has been, but it's also referencing the largest gift they've ever made. Why do you want to do that? because it creates a large reference point. And the immediate thought is, I bet I could do even better than that with this next gift. So conceptually, here's where we get to the idea of gifts of assets. Which gift is more valuable? Is it a $10,000 check or a $10,000 transfer of stock shares? Now, obviously, one gift may be a bit more hassle for the nonprofit, but it costs the donor less because they don't have to pay any of the capital gains tax on the appreciation. But it is also more powerful because it changes the reference point for future giving. A checking account is where disposable income lives. Appreciated assets, like a stock portfolio, is where wealth lives. And this is important because of the concept of mental accounting. In fact, the Nobel Prize in Economics a couple of years ago went to Richard Thaler in part for this concept of mental accounting. It's the idea that people put labels on money or wealth, and they treat that money or wealth differently depending upon those labels. In math, a dollar is a dollar, but in story, people put labels on those categories. And what we see from experimental research is when a new category of money becomes donation relevant, giving actually increases. Think of it this way. Suppose for the very first time you were, let's say, moving and you had extra household goods and you decided to donate those to a charity shop. Notice what happens from that point forward. Every time you're redecorating or moving, you have excess household goods, what comes to mind? The charity option comes to mind. In other words, that category of wealth has become donation relevant. Well, the same concept can apply the first time a donor makes a gift of, let's say, appreciated shares of stock. They learn that those capital gains taxes are optional. They don't have to pay them if they give appreciated assets rather than donate them. So once the donor makes that first gift, what comes to mind the next time they have some realization event where they're looking at selling a business or shares of stock or something that's going to generate a capital gain? Well, the charitable option comes to mind. And in fact, this isn't just a matter of just so stories or speculation. In fact, we've done analysis on over 1 million nonprofit tax returns to identify what is it that predicts long-term fundraising growth. And one of the most powerful predictors from this study that looked over 6 years of data, over 1 million nonprofit tax returns, was whether or not a charity received any gifts from non-cash sources like securities or real estate. Just to give you one quick example, suppose similar charities raised the same total contributions. The only difference is one had raised gifts only from cash and the other had raised gifts from both cash and stocks. 5 years later, on average, contributions will have grown twice as fast at that second organization. And if that second organization continued to raise gifts, including gifts of securities, their fundraising on average will have grown 6 times faster than the cash-only organization. So that's some of the concepts. How do we actually make this happen? How do we start? Of course, things start with listening. If we hear about an upcoming sale or retirement or inheritance, all of these are times for charitable planning. We want to be there to help the donors. We want to be a resource. If somebody asks you what you do, you can say, I help our donors give smarter. That's going to prompt a question, and that allows you to share a story about how someone gave an appreciated asset instead of cash, and that was more beneficial for the donor. It's a more powerful way to give because they get a double tax benefit. If they've held the asset for more than a year, they get the full tax deduction of the full fair market value of that asset, but they also get to avoid paying any of the capital gains taxes on that. And then we can share stories. Donor stories can include stocks, bonds, real estate, or businesses. We can share those personally. We can share them in communications. And again, the idea is that mindset matters. Gifts from disposable income stay small. Once a donor begins to think about donations as something that comes from wealth, things can change. And we see that also when it comes to a very particular kind of a gift of wealth, and that is an estate gift. Now, we already know that legacy gifts can be transformational for the organization because they can be massive. And in fact, one of the things we know from the IRS data is that as wealth increases, people give a larger share of their total contributions as estate gifts rather than as lifetime gifts. So obviously you could see as you get to those larger wealth categories and you're looking at 20, 40, 60, even 100 times annual giving on average, that can make a substantial difference. But I want you to notice the powerful psychology of what happens to a donor's current giving after they commit to a gift from their wealth. For most donors, the very first time they will commit to a gift of their wealth to a charity is when they make that commitment in their estate plan. Once a donor's wealth becomes donation relevant, it can be transformational for their giving. And here we see from a nationally representative study what happens to people's current giving after they add charity into their estate plan. Now, these are the same people before in the white bars as it is after in the black bars, but after people add charity into their estate planning, their current giving spikes about 77%, and that spike is sustained 2 years later, 4, 6, even 8 years later. So that commitment to a gift of wealth is a transformational commitment. So how do we have these conversations? Well, we can think of it in terms of story. I always like to use the phrase advance the donor's hero story. But what's also important is that we move that story to the setting of major gifts. Just a quick note, if you're not muted, you may want to mute yourself so you don't end up on the recording here. So the question here is this the land of wealth sharing? The idea is that in a story, setting matters. It creates expectations, it defines appropriate behaviors. You know, are we in a fantasy realm? Then we expect fantasy events. If we're in the Old West, we expect Old West things, but we don't expect an alien ship to land in a Zane Grey Western. The same idea applies to our conversations with major gifts. In fundraising, setting matters because major gifts are gifts of wealth. So getting the donors to talk about their wealth or their businesses can be very powerful. It can encourage generosity by changing that reference point. It can reveal capacity, and it can show donors future plans, which create opportunities for creative solutions. Now, by the way, in that story concept, there is a very powerful role known as the guiding sage who presents a challenge to the prospective hero to go on this adventure. This, by the way, is in the original Star Wars is Obi Kenobi, or in the original Matrix, this is Morpheus, or in The Hobbit, this is Gandalf the Grey. Now, the reason I bring that up is that this is the archetypal character for the fundraiser. The fundraiser can be that guiding sage for the donor's hero story. The fundraiser fulfills those same roles of giving advice and planning and guidance, introducing the hero to friends and allies who will help them complete the journey, and providing a magical instrument or weapon, whether that be a lightsaber or a charitable remainder trust. The fundraiser archetype also allows the idea of asking questions to learn what fits each hero's specific journey. And for major gifts, these involve questions about assets. So I understand the pushback on this. This feels uncomfortable. Well, first off, think about the goal for having asset conversations as a social goal, not strictly a financial goal. I mean, let me put it this way. Suppose your job was to create relationships at a Star Trek convention. How might you get ready for that? Maybe you should learn a little bit about Star Trek, right? Whether that's your favorite thing or not, you know it's going to be their favorite thing. Building and managing wealth is a big part of the lives of those who have capacity to make major gifts. So we want to be able to have these conversations. But here is the most important part. So many fundraisers are frightened of opening up these social conversations because they have the wrong destination in mind. Always, the destination for these conversations is to be able to get a meeting at which we'll be able to share valuable options at that next meeting. Keep in mind, the goal is not to quickly give the right technical answer. This remains true even if you know the right technical answer. The goal of these conversations ultimately is to get permission to share valuable options at the next meeting. If you understand this goal, that relieves all of the pressure from you thinking that the donor is going to respond with some hyper-technical question that's going to be on some CPA tax law exam. That question is not one you want to immediately answer. Instead, it becomes a justification for you to set another meeting with the donor at which you can present some valuable options after you've talked with some of your experts. For example, you might mention this to a donor. You know, you remind me of another donor. He was in a similar situation. I remember he used some creative planning. It avoided taxes and helped him make a big impact. Would you mind if I put together some ideas for you to look at? Notice what we're doing in this phraseology. We start out by creating a social norm. People like the donor have done things like this before. We then lead with value, creative planning, avoided taxes, made a big impact. We ask for permission to share even more value, put together some ideas for you to look at. And we can ask it in a way in which the desired answer is no, I wouldn't mind, because the no answer often feels safer. Here are some other ways that we might want to suggest introducing the donor hero's ally along the journey that can help them complete that heroic journey. One fundraiser suggests this. I can't tell you the ins and outs of a charitable remainder unit trust, but I'd be happy to introduce you to someone who can. I've been told that this instrument offers ways to maximize your giving, minimize income taxes, and provide a degree of flexibility in your financial situation. Is this something you'd be interested in? Or another example, you mentioned that you're going to pass the business on to your kids. Did you know there are some ways you can do that that will actually save you money on the transaction by being charitable? On my next visit, I'll bring our specialist in that area so we can talk about it in more detail. Keep in mind that the goal is not to be quick with the right answer. Don't fear these conversations because there might be some hyper-technical question you don't know the answer to, because even if you did know the answer, you don't want to give it then. You want to use that question as a reason to get the next meeting. There's a number of psychological reasons for that. Creating that time delay where you get permission to present some ideas, some valuable options for them to think about, keeps the initial conversation social. It separates that conversation from the financial ask. It gives you time to build creative options. Pick up the phone, call Innovia. They got lots of great folks there who can give you lots of ideas, especially if the donor's got some unusual asset. It also makes those options feel more valuable. It gives the donor time to think, moving that donor's mindset into the land of wealth sharing. They'll be thinking about their asset and they'll be thinking about their philanthropic goals before that meeting takes place. And that's the mental setting we want the donor to be in to make these major life commitment gifts. So we don't want to be quick with the right answer because, frankly, an epic scene requires some buildup. The guiding sage delivers the perfect weapon to help the hero complete the journey. But we don't want to do this immediately. We don't want to do it in an offhanded way. We want to do it after we've been given permission to present some ideas at the next meeting. Now, it's fine if we know what we're going to talk about to share a little bit about what we have in mind, but don't give the whole story because the goal is to get the next meeting. Expertise can help. And by the way, if you're interested in this sort of thing, please do just connect with me on LinkedIn. I'll send you links to a series of 65 videos on YouTube that go through all of plan giving, about 15 minutes apiece. If you do one a day, give it 2 or 3 months, and you'll know all of the different plan giving strategies we use. But even if you know those things, you don't want to instantly give the whole answer. Delay is valuable. It creates interest and attraction without giving away the whole story. It gives you time to consult experts and build solutions. So if somebody is pressing for an immediate answer, I want to talk with some of my technical folks first. That way you'll get all the best options. But I know there's some attractive possibilities here. And again, use the resources of your community foundation when you need someone to help you come up with some creative options. By the way, what if you set up that meeting and you thought there were some creative options and, well, maybe there isn't something there that you thought would be very exciting? If you get the next meeting, you can still succeed. You can present other powerful options of making gifts of assets and how those are smarter than making gifts of cash. And frankly, even if the donor says no, you've done some very powerful things. You've shared useful options. You've provided value to the donor as a guiding sage. So instead of being in the position of just asking, you're in the position of advising. Also keep in mind that setting is a place and a time. The place of the large life investment gift is the land of wealth sharing, but the time may not be today. It may be later when an investment or business is about to be sold, or at the end of life, or when a new project at the organization arises. However, if we have these asset conversations, it lays the groundwork for these future events. So let's talk a bit about some specific scripts. We want to talk about wealth because it's so powerful. It creates opportunities for creative solutions, whether the donor is planning to sell an appreciated asset or they're not planning to sell it, or they're getting ready to retire, or they're taking retirement account distributions. Maybe they've got a big income spike. Maybe they can't use tax deductions. Maybe they have kids who don't want to take over the farm or vacation home, or they've got estate tax issues, or their wealth is tied up in illiquid assets. Whatever the scenario, we've got a charitable plan for that. The point is to get that next meeting at which we can share those valuable options. How do we have conversations about potentially sensitive topics? We actually know some things from research about what works best. One of the approaches is to start social, then follow up. People are more forthcoming when you ask questions in a casual way rather than a buttoned up official tone. So we can simply start social. How's business? How's the market been treating you? The magic comes from the follow-up questions. These can show shared interest and reveal opportunities to share some advice. With every donor asset, there is a story. That story has a past, a present, and a future. And we can ask the donor about the past, the present, and the future of their asset story. The idea is that uncovering this story, once we learn the future plans for the asset, leads to those charitable planning opportunities. So we can ask about the past. What's the story of your business? How did you get started? The present. What are you proudest of? What are you most excited about at the current time? And ultimately, we then move to the future. What are your future plans for your business? What will that mean to you? Have you ever thought about using the sale or transition of your business as an opportunity to achieve some of your charitable goals in addition to your financial goals? Or if they're not planning to sell, will your heirs continue running the business? So, I know there's some smart ways to avoid taxes for people like you who want to include a gift to charity in their plans. Have you ever considered that? Of course, we can ask about all sorts of assets. Are you a collector? Art, stamps, coins, etc. What's the story? How did you get started? Do you invest in real estate? How did you get started? Notice we're doing that past, then present, then future story sequence. Where do you vacation? Do you own a home there? How's the market been treating you? What's your investment philosophy? What's the best investment you ever made? Tell me that story. We ultimately want to get to the charitable future. Have you considered making gifts with assets instead of cash? Or most owners giving at your level use appreciated assets instead of cash because they get a double tax benefit. Have you ever considered giving in that way? We can ask the how questions. Now, normally in major gifts fundraising, we want to ask the why questions that uncover connections to the donor's people, values, and life story. But the how questions can uncover the assets or the wealth. You've done so much for this organization. What allows you to be so generous? Or how are you able to make this wonderful gift? We can move from these how questions to wealth conversations. What makes it possible for you to make this generous cash gift? Have you ever given something other than cash to a charitable organization? Are you planning to sell something this year that's worth more than you paid for it? We can also use the reverse question. This is a statement that triggers a question. So, for example, we can say, if a donor asks us what we do, I help donors give smarter. I work for this organization. I help our donors give smarter. That's going to trigger a question. How do you do that? Or you can say, I help people give weird assets to our charity. That's going to trigger a question. What's the weirdest asset someone has given? Why do we want to trigger a question? Because that gives us permission to share a story. And the story we're going to share is one where your advice helps someone like the donor, or someone else's advice helps someone like the donor, where they give an asset instead of cash, and it ends with a question. Have you ever made any unusual investments? Or have you ever been hit with capital gains taxes? This then leads to the most powerful questions, which are the follow-up questions. Suppose you ask, have you ever made any unusual investments? And they say, yes. Ask about it. Has it gone up in value? Or they say no. Oh, so do you like stocks or bonds or something else? Or if we ask, have you ever been hit with capital gains taxes? And they say yes. Ask about it. Well, that must mean you were good at investing. Tell me what happened. Or if they say no, ask about it. Say, well, that's smart. It's good to avoid those as long as you can. Do you think that might be a problem in the future? Of course, when we're having these wealth conversations, they can also signal that they don't own any appreciated assets, and that's okay. That's a useful piece of information because most people without appreciated assets will be unlikely to have the capacity to make a major gift. The important thing to remember is that all of these conversations are not purely social. They actually all have the same destination. That destination is the meeting to share some valuable options with the donor. This reminds me of another donor's situation. I remember he used some creative planning that avoided taxes, created income, provided for family, and made a big impact to the charity. Would you mind if I talk to some of our experts and put together a few ideas for you to look at? And by the way, if you don't have experts to talk to, well, you do now, because there's experts at Innovia that are right there to help you out. Make questions part of another task. By the way, this is another way to get the information. As an estate planning attorney, I got to tell you, I could ask really blunt questions about wealth. Why? Because we were there to get a job done. Once people agree that we're there to get a task done, they're much more willing to just be very open with the information. There was a fun experiment that showed this. They randomly assigned people to one of two groups. Some people, they just asked them for a series of behaviors. Have you ever done this behavior? But for the other group, they created a task, which is rating the ethics of the behavior. So this group was asked, if you've ever done this behavior, how unethical do you think it was? And if you've never done this behavior, how unethical do you think it was? Now, if we had some other task, people were actually twice as likely to admit making a false insurance claim, cheating on a tax return, or lying about income. Now, of course, we're not trying to get people to admit those sorts of things, but the point is, if we can create a task that the donor wants to accomplish, and we need that information to help them with that task, then they're going to be very open about that information. Now, certainly once we get the meeting at which we can share valuable options, that now becomes a task that allows us to ask very specific questions. Oh, well, since we have this meeting planned, let me ask you a couple of questions about that asset we were talking about. Tell me a little bit about when you bought that and how much appreciation you have, and anything else you want to tell me about that asset so I can put these ideas together for you, right? We've agreed on that task, but it may be agreement on a philanthropic task. What's holding you back from reaching your charitable goals? What if it was possible for you to make a gift and still accomplish your financial goals? Would you mind if I shared some of those options with you? Or you mentioned that you're going to be passing the business on to your kids, selling your practice. Would you be interested in charitable options that may save you money on your transaction? Notice once you get agreement to that, you've got an agreement on a task, which then justifies all of the very blunt, specific questions you want to know about their asset. Or you've been so generous to this cause in the past. Would you be interested in learning how to give more at a lower cost by using the best assets for the gift? Again, after we agree to the task, questions can become much more blunt. How do you give? Through a company, a private foundation? Do you normally give appreciated assets? How's your business structured? Is it difficult to get profits out due to tax concerns? Or do you have any life insurance policies you no longer need? We are just collecting all of the data because we've agreed that we're going to get back together and present some valuable options. We can also use a gift menu in conversation. For example, I help donors like you give smarter. Usually this involves gifts of stocks, real estate, businesses, life insurance, or retirement accounts. The tax benefits can be much larger. Have you ever considered other types of gifts? Again, we create a menu and see if any of those things may have been of interest. Now, I'm talking about doing this one-on-one, but of course we can do this in a survey, a response card, or a website where we ask folks to check or click to receive information about how to save taxes with gifts of stocks or bonds, top tax tips for gifts of real estate, tax smart giving from a retirement account, giving smarter with closely held businesses, or how to avoid estate taxes with charitable planning. The point is, when they ask for that information, that reveals that they have the asset and are thinking about doing something philanthropic with it. We can also just ask for opinions. We need to justify asking for opinions, ask for the permission, and then ask for those opinions. So, for example, we've noticed that other charities receive more of their gifts from stock and real estate, and we're trying to figure out why. Do you mind if I ask a few questions about your thoughts on this? Then, what's the likelihood you would ever consider making a gift of stocks or bonds, real estate, will, cryptocurrency, artwork, oil rights? What have you heard about the extra tax benefits of donating assets instead of cash, or leaving estate gifts from an IRA or 401k? By the way, we can even change the setting after the gift decision. Cheery Kochi shares this story. He said, I had a donor on the phone. He said, I'm going to send you a check for $2,000. I said, Jim, is there any chance you have stock that's worth $2,000? He said, yes, absolutely, but I don't want to sell that stock right now. I said, take the cash, go buy that exact same stock, then send us the old shares worth $2,000. Now you have stepped up basis. That highly appreciated stock now starts at zero for capital gains tax purposes, and you get a charitable deduction as well. He asked, I can do that? I said, yeah. The next day, you received a stock gift, not of $2,000, but of $10,000. Why? Because we've changed the reference point. So we can change the setting after the estate gift decision. For example, if you plan to leave something to charity in your estate plan, could I share with you a way to make sure the best assets are used for the gift to minimize the loss in taxes? So we can open up these conversations about assets. We can change the setting even after the pledge decision. I can't thank you enough for this tremendous commitment to our charity. When I come back to finalize the details of how you want to allocate the gift, I'll bring a colleague who specializes in putting together gifts to maximize the tax benefits for you. All right, so we've been talking about a whole bunch of different ideas in a very short period of time about encouraging these asset conversations. But I got to admit, there's a big difference between knowing and doing. I can share with you all the theory. I can share with you all the statistics, and you might nod your head and say the idea makes sense, but the execution can be a little bit scary. Again, as Chiri Nkosi shares, you intervene in the process, and you may actually stop and say, no, I don't want your cash. I know that's scary, folks. I get it, but this is what you need to do. What this really means is being the donor's helper in the conversation. Notice the concept that we're trying to do here. We're taking on a different role. We are moving beyond the cash gift. Why? In order to help the donor. Sometimes that means we're willing to take on more administrative hassle. Why? In order to help the donor. We provide guidance, wisdom, counsel as the donor's guiding sage. When we start to play that role, it expands the kinds of relationships and therefore the kinds of conversations that we can have with donors. Because our role is no longer simply one of just asking. It actually becomes one of presenting some good ideas, presenting some valuable options, being a source of information, of guidance, of wisdom, of ideas that can be really valuable. And once we change that role, it can be so powerful for the kinds of conversations that we can have, and therefore for the size of gifts that can be created. So that's a bit about how we can have these conversations that lead to wealth scripts. If you're interested in any of this sort of thing, please do connect with me on LinkedIn, because I share all of my stuff for free. I'll send you all the books that I've written for free, at least the digital copies of them, all my slide sets, including this one, as well as the video series that I mentioned. Happy to share any of that for free with any folks who have interest. Just connect with me on LinkedIn and I'll send that to you that way. Well, I'm supposed to stop talking here. So I know that I need to have a ending point. Otherwise, look, I'm a professor and a lawyer. I'll just keep going and going. But I'd love to know if folks have any thoughts or comments, snide remarks, whatever comes to mind. So I'll go ahead and stop there and turn it over to you.
All right, thanks. Thank you, Dr. James. That was unbelievable, as per usual. The challenge with listening to one of your presentations and you want to write down a question, if you stop to think about a question, then you miss like 2 or 3 slides. So it's difficult to do that during your presentation. And rest assured, we will send everybody a copy so you didn't have to scribble down all those brilliant prompts. But one question as we were going through that, you touched on charitable remainder trust. So based on how the market is trending right now, based on the increase in interest rates, is this a good time to encourage some charitable remainder trusts?
Yeah, absolutely. Charitable remainder trusts were much more common and powerful in a higher interest rate, higher inflation environment in the past. And we're starting to run into that again. And also, by the way, the demographic that is the age of people who tends to set up these kinds of charitable remainder trusts, those tend to be people right around age 75. That's where we've got the leading edge of the baby boom. So we've got kind of the perfect combination for charitable remainder trusts coming up. And I think those are going to be more powerful in the years to come. By the way, let me mention this, because I know there are some people who say, oh, the market's down, and so we should, the power of gifts of assets have gone away. Folks. No. People still have appreciated assets. Number one, yeah, the market's down. Is it down more than where the market was, say, 3 years ago? No. If anybody's been in the market 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, they've still got a lot of appreciated assets. And by the way, even in the market itself, is the whole market down? I'll give you a little hint. Living in West Texas, where we got nothing but oil around here, not everyone is down right now, okay? So there are lots of segments where we've got lots of appreciated assets. Real estate's going crazy in lots of places, and different segments of the market. So the whole point is, just because you look at Dow Jones and say, oh, that's down, we don't have appreciated assets. No. We still got massive appreciated assets. We still want to be having these conversations. And by the way, as we move into an inflationary environment, that simply makes this even more powerful. An inflationary environment creates nominal appreciation of assets, which means capital gains taxes get way more powerful. You can avoid all of those. How do you do that? With creative charitable planning.
That's excellent. And for our, for the many folks in attendance today, if you do have donors and they're having those questions and you're getting out of your comfort zone, we absolutely can step in, and we're happy to join you for those conversations. Aaron, PJ, myself, just reach out and let us know. All right, so we've got a question from Jennifer. Just went away. What are your favorite tools for giving real estate to charity?
Absolutely. And I'll say this is for real estate in particular, but applies to all kinds of valuable, especially unusual assets. The world is so different today than it was, say, 20 years ago. And that is because there's two reasons for that. One, if you're big and sophisticated and want to directly accept that asset, we've actually got new legal instruments, such as the single asset LLC, that nonprofits can now use to completely protect the rest of their foundation or other entity from liability, environmental or otherwise. But if you don't want to get all big and sophisticated, that's okay, because we can always accept that gift. We may just need to help the donor run it through a donor advised fund. Start with your local community foundation. They can help you with these things. And by the way, if you get an asset that's too weird for your local community foundation, as long as it's still valuable, they can point you to specialized donor advised funds who do nothing but focus on these weird assets. So the point is, if you have a donor who wants to give you something valuable, the answer is never no. It may simply be, absolutely, we would love that. I'll just need to work with you to show you how to run that through a donor advised fund. But we would love that gift. It could make a huge impact here. So that is definitely something that was a tool we didn't have 20 years ago. We do have that today, and not just for real estate, although it becomes very powerful for real estate. And let me say one other thing about real estate, because frankly, I know there's some really big, really sophisticated organizations that the fundraisers actually don't want to accept the real estate directly. They want to work with the donor advised fund. And the reason is they're at these big bureaucratic organizations that sometimes don't act quickly to get the real estate sold. When there is somebody who's ready to close the transaction, you end up with a hacked off donor because your organization's so slow. So they will actually intentionally ship everything through a donor advised fund that is able to close these things fast, that knows how to deal with these transactions. So you end up with a much happier donor along the way. So again, very powerful tool for those kinds of gifts.
Yeah, it's such a great question. And speaking on behalf of Inovia, just in the last year alone, we've accepted 1 million shares of penny stock. We've been approached with the gift of mineral and oil rights. Of course, the real estate, business interest, insurance proceeds. So many different types of assets out there, and we can help vet and receive those and convert them into charitable dollars. Thanks for that question. Any other questions or comments? Colleagues, Aaron, PJ, anything you want to add or join in the
Dr.
discussion?
James, I'd like to ask, in this social media age that we're in, how responsive have potential donors been to being approached digitally?
Great question, Kevin. So there's a number of different levels that we can use digital media. We can start with simply sharing stories. The message we want to communicate is that people like you make gifts like this. Technically, it's called a social norm, but it's the idea that, hey, this is a normal thing to do, to give appreciated assets, whether it's stocks or real estate or whatever it might be. This is a smarter way to give. And people like you make these kinds of gifts. So we can share stories about how people are being smarter with their gifts. That can go all the way up to having one-on-one conversations on platforms like this one we're on right now, to again, start by sharing some stories, asking for permission to put together some valuable options and ideas for them to look at. And once you've gotten permission for that next meeting, which by the way, is essentially they're giving you permission for a proposal or a soft proposal meeting at that point, then you can ask very specific questions about the asset. Tell me a little bit more about that. Tell me the story of that. Any details I should know as I'm building out these kinds of options. And that more and more donors are willing to have those kinds of meetings with, by Zoom if we can't do them face to face. So I think there's the whole spectrum of things that we can use on that media, whether we're just sort of broadcasting, sharing these stories that say people like you make these gifts, or we're having those one-on-one conversations if donors give us permission to do that.
Great
Dr. James,
question.
I wanted to mention something on behalf of Innovia. We have been faced with so many very interesting, complex gifts that we have formed a separate supporting organization, so we can hold those assets in the supporting organization in separate funds, so that we minimize any negative impact of expenses or other complications related to that asset. And then once we liquidate those, we move them into the nonprofits funds or whatever fund the donor wants to do. But we have some really incredible volunteers that have donated their time to help us evaluate gifts of real estate. The most unusual was probably the one Chris worked on, where we weren't sure what to do about the dead cow between the house and the barn, and whether we could, sell that before we dealt with the cow. But anyway, we've got really qualified people to help address those.
So even if you're a one-person shop, you can talk to a donor and say, well, I want to talk to my real estate team about that, because you've got a real estate team. That's what Innovia is there for.
Life insurance, valuing life insurance, there are ways to do that now that we didn't have several years ago, as well as, real estate is probably the most interesting right now.
Perfect. Thank you. All right. Out of respect for everybody's time, we will wrap it up. Again, thanks to Dr. James. What a phenomenal presentation. So much information. Again, we will follow up with an email. We'll give you a link to the presentation. We'll also include a link to the recording because you probably will need to watch it again. So as always, we appreciate it. We look forward. We're going to have Dr. James back in the house on Thursday, and then again a month from now for 2 additional programs. So thank you, everybody, for joining, and thank you, Dr. James.
Thanks, everybody.